Hi, my name is Dr. Suzan Song. I'm a consultant for the MHPSS Collaborative on Children and Family in Universities. I'm also the Division Director of Child, Adolescent, and Family Psychiatry at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm really excited today to present the UNICEF guidelines on community-based MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support. So why have these guidelines? Well, we have emerging evidence on how children can best cope through adversity. We know that we've learned lessons from the evaluation of existing approaches. And we know that there are unique challenges right now that today's crises pose for children's safety and well-being and for their optimal development. We also know there's a need to strengthen the systems that transition from early emergency response to recovery and regular programming. So the aim of these guidelines are really to restore and strengthen family and community supports and systems, and really aims to do three things. One is to reduce and prevent harm. Two is to bolster resilience to recover from adversity. And three is to provide the conditions that enable children and families to really survive and thrive. These aims are all closely aligned with the work of the Child Protection Alliance to reduce risks and strengthen protective factors that reinforce child and family resilience. Now, these guidelines are really for many people, UNICEF staff, partners, other agencies that are working with children in humanitarian settings to help them effectively embed MHPSS programs for child and family well-being in the community. So these guidelines are structured in about 4 parts, and we'll go through each of these parts. The first is understanding community-based MHPSS, and this is really adhering to the social ecological model with 3 tiers of support. The next section is really operationalizing community-based MHPSS in the framework, with 9 circles of support, implementing activities within the framework, monitoring and evaluation, and community engagement and participation. And there's also a section of annexes, and then there's a separate compendium with a list of resources that are extremely helpful in implementation. So, what do you think of when one says community-based MHPSS? What are those key elements? These operational guidelines start by exploring what we mean by community-based MHPSS and its key elements. So community-based MHPSS should strengthen natural supports and systems to improve the overall care environment for kids and families, and also to link to non-humanitarian response. It makes use of community knowledge and capacities, so it recognizes that families and communities are the first responders. They're the front line for children's care. It requires skill and specific competencies that can be taught and learned. This is very challenging work, and it requires skills to understand, analyze, negotiate. Sometimes, for example, local belief systems and practices that may cause harm. Negotiate to make best use of local resources. A community-based MHPSS approach also involves the community in all phases of programming, ensuring engagement, ensuring interventions that don't undermine our natural supports. It addresses interventions at all layers of the pyramid in an integrated way, with functional referral between layers, looking at all the various entry points in the community for MHPSS interventions, for example, in schools. And it includes both lay and professional services and psychological and social supports. So it's important that lay and professional actors work together for seamless coverage of care. Now, they do this through 3-tiered supports of the child, the caregiver, and at the community level, and then 9 circles of support within this 3-tiered approach, which I'll talk about now. So many of you may be familiar with the social ecological model. This illustrates the tiers of support that are surrounding a child. So we have the child in the center. Closest to them are family and primary caregivers with whom the child interacts the most and who primarily provide comfort, support, safety, opportunities for development and learning. The next circle are those in the community, like teachers, coaches, healthcare workers, friends, peers, extended family. And all of this is contextually embedded in the larger culture and society. So working through this model, the environment for everyone is strengthened, for all children, families, and community members. The social ecological model is operationalized in the guidelines into 3 tiers for the child, the family, and the community in very practical terms. It's within these 3 tiers where we have 9 circles of support. And so here we'll go through each of these 9 circles of support. So the first are safe, nurturing environments at home, school, in the community. The second are positive relationships with caregivers, friends, teachers, and other community members. Third are opportunities for stimulation, learning, and skills development, inclusive of kids of all ages, genders, and abilities. 4 is support for parent and caregiver well-being, coping, and recovery. And so this might include capacity building as well as focused care for parents with mental health issues or support for teachers. 5 are knowledge and skills for parenting and supporting children in distress, as well as children with mental health issues. 6 is access to family and community support networks. For example, helping the inclusion and participation of vulnerable families into community life. 7 is awareness of child and family well-being and protection needs. So communities can take positive action, for example, to reduce stigma, to ensure that children are protected in the community. 8 is activation of natural community supports. And this can include outreach to vulnerable families, for example. And 9 is a strengthening of core systems for children and families. This really builds the workforce of lay and professional care providers, systems, and structures. So in this graphic, you can see that there are 3 tiers of support that operate across all layers of the pyramid in a very integrated way. So all MHPSS approaches, no matter what the actual targeted program is, must be aware of the other layers and help children and families to access the services they need at each layer. There's also specific guidance for activities across each tier that are in this operationalized framework for each layer of the pyramid. Specific examples of these approaches are given in the framework. UNICEF field programs and partners can choose from these approaches in ways that align with the needs of children and families in your area, that make best use of existing resources within your programmatic aims. It's not exactly a menu in that it's not appropriate for any program to operate solely at one layer of the pyramid. MHPSS is a composite term and requires a composite approach. So any program must know its relationship and interface to other layers and be able to work in a system-wide way according to your own capacities. So let's take an example here. Let's just think about if you have a child with a higher level mental health need that comes to a child-friendly space. How could you support a community-based MHPSS approach for this child? Right. So if you think about the 3 tiers of child, family, community, and the 9 circles of support, maybe just pause and write down or think about some ways that you could support a community-based MHPSS approach. So child-friendly space staff must be able to identify these children, have basic competencies to support them, and refer them when needed to pre-identified higher-level supports. Once kids are receiving higher-level services, the child-friendly staff would need to understand their condition and its treatment, support that treatment, and work with the child to remain an integral part of the child-friendly space activities. They would also need to be able to support the caregivers and offer linkages to services for them as well. So there's a close relationship between the social and psychological aspects of children's well-being and development. MHPSS approaches therefore cover both psychological and social interventions. These use both non-specialist and professional staff to meet the needs of children and families within the community. Both non-specialist and professional staff must have relevant competencies for their tasks. So setting minimum standards and qualifications for all providers is important, in a successful community-based MHPSS program. For example, professional staff like doctors and nurses may provide the clinical, psychological, or psychiatric services, like medication for treatment of a neurological or a mental disorder or counseling. And social service professionals may provide specialized protection and social services, like case management. With training and supervision, non-specialist providers can provide non-clinical support to children and families, like peer support, psychological first aid, and identification and referral of those in need of specialized help. So we can take these following steps to ensure program implementers have the skills, the knowledge, and the systems to implement a community-based MHPSS intervention, and also track your quality and progress over time. So here are some steps to implement a community-based MHPSS approach. So 1, we can recruit staff or volunteers locally, being careful to ensure culture and gender appropriateness, to screen for child protection concerns, and to not weaken existing structures by pulling away skilled staff members. 2, we can train and supervise local staff and volunteers through participatory, skills-based training and ongoing regular supervision. We set minimum qualifications for various roles and ensure they're equipped for their tasks. It is absolutely essential to include staff care strategies in addition to regular supervision. This is fundamental to both quality programming and preventing burnout. And 3, we can establish information management systems and standard operating procedures as an essential part of any program, ensuring that these systems meet ethical requirements like confidentiality, that they're user-friendly, and that local program implementers are trained in them. Now, monitoring and evaluation are very important aspects of a community-based MHPSS approach. The log frame for the guideline supports the assessment, design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of MHPSS strategies. Each program requires its own monitoring and evaluation framework, depending on the specific activities and envisioned outcomes and their goals. So this log frame can be used as an inspiration for designing and monitoring and evaluation framework that's relevant to your own specific programming approaches. You can choose relevant indicators, adapt them, or add your own. So you can look at Annex 4 that has the complete log frame with specific indicators for key outcomes and their corresponding outputs. Here there are 5 impact indicators and 5 key outcomes that you can reference. But all MHPSS programs and projects should use at least one impact indicator from the common goal, plus at least one outcome and corresponding outcome indicator from the common framework. So within these guidelines, there's also a section on community engagement and participation. It's a how-to chapter on how to work with communities, including the various steps involved and the principles that underpin this work. Now, this is really about meaningful inclusion and participation of community members, fairly representative of the various members. Again, this is very challenging work, and so there are tips included here that are also drawn from other existing resources that provide practical strategies for this work. So there are 6 steps on how we can start to engage the community in participation. So first, we can learn about the context. Start with a desk review. A situation analysis can teach us about the social, cultural context for kids and families, maps the risks, resources, and the priority areas for intervention in the emergency context. 2, we can identify and meet with the community stakeholders, have a stakeholder analysis that helps to ensure inclusive representation in engagement activities. For example, government and civil society actors, childcare organizations like school boards, religious organizations, youth and women's groups, women leaders, people with disabilities, and others. 3, we can conduct an inclusive participatory assessment of needs and resources. This requires bringing diverse voices to an understanding of the community, how the emergency has affected coping capacities, and how different communities see their own risks and resources. Care should be taken to safely and appropriately engage boys and girls, women and men, and vulnerable or marginalized children and families. 4, we can facilitate inclusive participatory planning of solutions and interventions. The stakeholder analysis and participatory assessment findings are shared with stakeholders, like a planning committee that's representative of diverse voices, to plan the way forward together. Ensure that children, youth, and families have the opportunity to engage in the design of programs that's relevant to their own needs. It's often necessary to support members of planning committees to be able to participate effectively, especially if they aren't used to speaking up and having their opinions regarded seriously. 5, we can support program implementation by community actors. The role of external agencies is usually to support program implementation with technical and financial assistance. When possible, this means maximizing community and governmental resources for sustainability, supporting existing community initiatives, and building capacity of the community to sustain their own solutions. And 6, to monitor and evaluate interventions together. This ensures a wide range of voices, including boys and girls, marginalized children and families, and feedback about program outcomes and effectiveness, and gives a comprehensive and clear view of the impact and the shortcomings of the interventions. It's critical for transparency and accountability. Now, there is a list of annexes that have some background information about the evolving context and UNICEF key commitments, frameworks, and standards. The log frame is detailed in the annex, and there are also 3 case studies that are graciously shared by UNICEF program staff in South Sudan, Nepal, and Lebanon. And finally, but very importantly, there is an annex on what other actors can do. So this is an annex related to the important issue of cross-sectoral mainstreaming of MHPSS approaches. There are also a compendium of resources. They're extremely important. So these are guidelines and recommendations to give an overview and how one can strengthen communities to meet MHPSS needs in a very challenging environment. We'll see what additional tools need to be developed. You all might highlight gaps where we need tools to be able to do this in a stepwise implementation manner. But the purpose of these guidelines are really just to give resources, to lay out principles and support where their resources already exist. So there are links to the compendium and resources that are throughout the document with recommended interventions and actions. Again, the guidelines do not describe how to implement, but rather to inspire field programs across an IASC layer of intervention. So here you'll see the compendium is on mhpss.net. It's not as a hard document, but this is really a forum for sharing and discussing resources. Now, to conclude, I'll ask kind of a question of anything that you might have learned, hopefully something, through this whole webinar. So I'll ask you, what are the benefits to using a community-engaged MHPSS programming? Just think for yourself, in your context, what some of the benefits might be and how you might implement this. So a community-based MHPSS program will ensure that programs are relevant to local realities, cultural values, and understandings, make the best use of local resources, effectively identify children and families who are vulnerable or who have special needs, and actively promote their inclusion in interventions. It will strengthen the natural supports in families and communities to care for children, strengthen the capacities of childcare systems for broad impact, and it will promote the local ownership of programs for long-term sustainability. So I thank you for your time. I know these are difficult times right now, but I appreciate your attention. Thank you.